Hello, I'm Bryan Glick. I'm the Editor-in-Chief of Computer Weekly. Put aside for a moment the fact that you're most likely an IT expert or a cybersecurity expert. Think about the last time in your personal life you were trying to access a website, to use a particular service, to go online to buy something, and you couldn't. The website was down. It was working really slowly. Things weren't working. Think even of the last time you went into a physical store in the high street and you were told, yeah, sorry, our card terminals aren't working. You're going to have to pay cash. It's annoying, isn't it? It's frustrating. Knowing that you're an IT expert or a cybersecurity expert, you're probably in that situation as well, thinking, well, thank goodness that's not me. We all know the importance of maintaining uptime for our organisations' IT systems. We know about the dangers of lost revenue, the damage to reputation, how it hits brands, the loss of customer trust that can come from these large-scale IT systems having problems and being unable to deliver a good customer service. Now we're going to talk a little bit about that in this video. We're going to examine the challenges of cyber resilience at large scale, whether that's at a national level, an international level, but the sort of cyber resilience you need to make sure that your organisation isn't making tomorrow's news headlines. Now, to help me examine some of these issues, I'm joined by Richard Meeus. Richard is the Director of Security, Technology and Strategy for Europe, Middle East and Africa at Akamai. Richard, welcome. Thanks for coming on to join us today.
Thank you very much.
Now, Richard, every organisation, of course, no matter what their size, is going to be aware of the need to keep their systems up and to maximise uptime, to avoid downtime as much as they can. But when we're talking about these massive scale organisations, whatever they may be, whether it's retailers or banks or anything like that, what are the particular challenges of cyber resilience for organisations at that sort of scale?
Yeah, I think when you're looking at organisations where sort of that peak is far in excess of their sort of normal scale of operations, there needs to be an additional level of controls that are around there and the ability to scale, whether it's in the width of the back-end systems, whether it's in their sort of capacity at the edge. I mean, a good example of this was a few years ago with the NHS. Now, obviously, the NHS app got a lot of take-up during COVID for obvious reasons, but there was one thing that they used to call their Glastonbury moment. And this was when, the NHS app wasn't being particularly used a lot, or the site wasn't being used a huge amount. But then it was announced that vaccinations were going to be made and people should be able to go online and book their slots for their vaccinations. This created, obviously, as you'd expect, unprecedented demand. Huge amount of requests were sent to the NHS platform. But they planned for this. They planned for this peak. What they'd done is they'd leveraged CDNs, they'd leveraged cloud-based web application firewalls, they'd leveraged queuing processes and visitor prioritization to allow them to process 1 million appointments in one day. And when you compare the app and the capacity to where it was previously because of the general uptake, that was a huge peak. So it's all about understanding that preparation and where they needed to do for the back end to ensure how many requests per second that could take, but make sure the cloud services in front of it were able to keep the customers happy, but then also let the request through at the required speed so it didn't overwhelm the back end. And that planning was a key part of that, but liaising and leveraging the partners as best as possible was also key.
No, that's that's a great example of planning cyber resilience in an extraordinary circumstances, or at least we hope it will be extraordinary one-off circumstances. But for a lot of very large organisations, they have regular peak trading type moments. It might be, if you're a retailer, it might be Black Friday, that sort of thing. These sort of times of the year when the amount of traffic coming through your network is going to be unusually high. But not only do you know that it's going to be unusually high, cyber attackers know it's going to be unusually high as well. What are the biggest threats that organisations see generally associated with these regular peak high traffic sort of moments?
You're absolutely right. I mean, we used to see this a lot on certain days. So as you say, on Black Friday, there's going to be a spike of traffic. So the criminals know that they also know that you're getting a spike of traffic, but that's probably your most important day of trading for the year. If you want to make a point to that company, then that's the day to do it, because you're going to get the full and undivided attention of the security teams and just about everybody else. So what the organizations really need to do is work out and test to sort of say, okay, well, what is our limit? Where do we max out at? And if we're maxing out at that point, what do we need to do can we move something? Can we offload some an extra piece of code or whatever to out to the cloud or out to the edge to try and optimize it better in those times of peak? Because you're absolutely right. The attackers can come in with a layer 7 DDoS, a layer 3, 4 DDoS, an application attack, and with the volumes of traffic you're seeing, would you be able to detect it? Would you be able to block it?
Talk there, Richard, about a number of the different techniques that attackers are likely to use to try and target organizations at scale. And some of the most common ones you talked about there, things like denial of service and bot attacks, of course, although there are other means as well. We're seeing these sort of types of attacks and these techniques evolving all the time. Give us a little picture of where we are today with this. What's happened over the last year or so to see how these sort of techniques have developed, and what makes it so hard to defend against these evolving techniques at that sort of huge scale.
With DDoS attacks, and when they're sort of combined with your peak periods, you're going to see a huge amount of traffic coming into your estate, and you really need to be offloading things like DDoS, things like application attacks, layer 7 DDoS attacks, as far away from you as possible, because you want to be focusing only on the legitimate traffic coming into your estate, because you're going to be hard pushed to serve all of your legitimate requests without billions and trillions of unwarranted malicious requests as well. So what you want to be able to look at is how can I block that? How can I get rid of all of that traffic before it even gets close to my estate? And this is where sort of cloud-based services, edge-based services really come into their own, because it means that you can block the attacks at source rather than waiting until it gets into your estate. So that's probably the primary thing to be able to do that, because generally you're working in a national or a relatively sort of geo-focused area. You want to make sure that all the requests coming from the local areas are prioritized. But if you've got DDoS attacks coming in from Southeast Asia or from South America, you don't want to be shipping that traffic all the way over to you. You want to be blocking that overseas. Also, where else are you going to get attacks against? Are things like your DNS. I mean, DNS, much maligned, overlooked part of our security establishment. But as we all know, without DNS, nothing works. And so we're seeing an increased amount of focus on organizations attacking the DNS, trying to overload the DNS server, because if the DNS server gets overloaded through specific types of attacks, what can happen is it can then no longer do legitimate requests. And if you can't respond to legitimate requests, your websites will stop working, your APIs will stop working, your email will stop working. And we're also seeing a lot of attacks now focusing on the ability of APIs and their ability to respond at scale, because organizations are now deploying, rather than just having a website that's presenting everything out to the world, they're leveraging their apps, and their apps through all their mobile connections coming back into their origin. But now you're going to have a whole host of requests coming in from services talking to those APIs. So now you've got a lot less visibility. Now you haven't got information about browser types or anything else like that. You've just got a very small request coming through an API, and you have to differentiate, is that coming from a legitimate user, or is that malicious or malformed? So therefore you have these additional challenges that you need to take into account.
You talked there, Richard, about some of the many challenges that cybersecurity leaders face from a technological and from a security protection perspective. But of course, there's another challenge that they face as well, and that's not just protecting the organization. It's helping to make sure that the customer experience, the user experience that an organization is delivering is the best it can be. We've all, I'm sure, experienced times where that the experience you're getting of using a website or an internal system, whichever it might be, is not as good as it could be, And often that's because of some of the cyber controls that have been put in place. It's a difficult balance to get right. How should organisations go about managing that trade-off between getting your cyber resilience right and still maintaining optimum customer experience?
Yeah, the UX against security sort of balance is always being a challenge, and realistically, nobody likes to see the grid of pictures saying pick out all the fire hydrants and that. Who knows what a fire hydrant is outside the US. Managing that, nobody likes that experience. So we want to try and take that security control and put that in the background so it's transparent to the end user. But also we need to be looking at how we're doing our authentication processes as a whole. I think passkeys are a great opportunity to leverage this now, because with passkeys, a lot of the big social networks are doing it, and AWS and Azure and these sort of guys, they're all taking on passkeys. It's a great way of having a sort of it's your identity plus your MFA rolled into one. Great tool. I mean, it really reduces that risk of having your password exposed. So I think getting organizations to adopt passkeys as well will be a great way to benefit their user experience, but also keeping the security level, especially around credential abuse and account takeover.
Let me come back to something that you mentioned earlier on, Richard, as well. You talked about how there's a particularly effective technique, which is about keeping the attacker at a distance, at scale, keeping the attacks as local to the source of the attack as possible. And this is part of what most of us in the tech world now called edge computing or edge security. And I know this has become an increasingly important infrastructural aspect of cyber resilience. Let's just explore that in a little more detail. How does working at the edge help organizations to be more secure and to be more responsive when it comes to customer experience?
Edge security has been around for a while now, and certainly we were pioneering this sort of 15 odd years ago. So the idea of putting security across the globe and being able to block attacks as close to the source as possible is seen, I think, now as being sort of the most effective way of keeping around, especially the large-scale volumetric attacks and the application attacks and the known attacks. Doing that at scale away from your estate is key. But what we're able to do now is we can do so much more at the edge just than do DDoS and a web application and firewall. We can now do lots of other intelligent operations on the data request as it comes in. So that's not just only on security. So we can look at authorization. We can look at authentication for APIs and things like that. We can also start putting on a bit of compute on there as well. So what this means is that from the customer's perspective, especially when you're looking at these peak periods, a lot of that sort of personalization, that process that could be done at origin, now can be done at the edge. So a lot of, if you can start doing that, you can now start to distribute your compute, not from a couple of core data centers or hyperscalers, but you can now distribute this compute all over the country, all over the Europe, all over the world. And doing this dramatically reduces the core amount of requests that your origin has to manipulate. So this is a great way of basically distributing your security, distributing your compute, but within a single control and a single policy.
Yeah, I mean, I can really see how in these sort of complex environments we're talking about at large scale, edge is clearly a really important tool to consider and a tool to use to help improve your security and resilience globally, internationally, whatever's appropriate for your business. Let's look at the other side of that. That's something you can do, but I'm sure you probably come in all the conversations that you have across some pretty common gaps that organizations have when they're trying to scale their cyber resilience to deal with the sort of large scale attacks that we're talking about. What would you say are the biggest gaps and most commonest gaps that you come across?
Well, I think with anybody, with organisation that has to deal with these peak periods, they're normally leveraging a sort of hybrid infrastructure. They'll have their on-prem infrastructure, they maybe have their own data centers, and they're probably leveraging hyperscalers as well, 1, 2, or 3 of them to optimize their performance. What then tends to happen is that when you're looking at this from a capacity planning and also a security perspective, is how do you maintain consistent security across all of those estates? And how do you maintain visibility across all of those estates, especially when you're having to scale up to provide capacity for peak? So I think one of the core gaps is the visibility into those entire estates, and therefore the security overlay that goes across that. So you tend to get doglegs between what's happening in one particular data center and one particular hyperscaler. So what the drive is to do is to say, okay, how can we put a single security policy with a single visibility engine across all of that, so we can see all of our data centers, all of our assets, all of our data flows, and put a security wrapper around that. That means, okay, we know exactly what's coming into our estate, and we can mitigate and control across every single asset with the same policy.
Let's try and wrap all this up then in one last question for you. You know, you've talked a lot about the challenges of managing cyber resilience at this sort of large scale. You've talked a lot about some of the technologies and techniques that can help organizations to manage resilience at scale. Imagine I'm a retailer. I've got a massive peak trading coming up later this year. It might be Black Friday. It might be something else, and I need to make sure I've got my cyber resilience in place, ready for that. If you could give me one piece of advice right now that I should take into consideration to make sure I'm going to have the resilience and security I need for that upcoming peak, what would that be?
I think it ties into this. So first of all, assume something's going to break. Work on that principle. And to do that, I think you really need to go through the what if scenario and start thinking, what if this happens? What if this happens? What if that breaks? What if that doesn't work? You know, if I'm using a third party provider for my postcode lookups, you know, what is the amount of connections they can take? Will it work with 1,000 connections a second or something like that? An example is an old CISO at Akamai used to have this story about taking what if to the next level. And he used to encourage his team to really sort of stretch the parameters of the what if question. So consequently, we ended up with a disaster recovery plan, or a business recovery plan for a zombie apocalypse. And yeah, they went through it and they worked through all the procedures of what they'd actually had to do for that. I mean, obviously we did lots of other business response recovery plans as well. But interestingly, having a business recovery plan for a zombie apocalypse, which involved sending the entire company home for 6 months, proved pretty useful by the start of the pandemic. And that's what I mean about doing the what ifs, because it doesn't matter if it doesn't exactly match. If you've got a process and a work through for that and a run book that can say, if this happens, do this, or this effect happens, then you've got a process to do that, and you've got the ability to stay on top of it. So doing that what if scenario planning, I think, is really important.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly hope that not many people who are watching this are genuinely going to have to plan for a zombie apocalypse. That would be a whole new challenge for everybody to take on. But Richard Meeus from Akamai, thank you for coming along and sharing your insights and experiences of building cyber resilience at scale.
Thank you very much.
That's all we've got time for on this video. We've talked about the really unique challenges faced by organisations who operate at really large scale, and what it takes to make sure that they can minimise downtime, maximise resilience within their IT infrastructures. And I really hope you've been able to take away some useful tips and ideas that you might be able to apply in your organisation. Thanks for watching.